Okay, so now we're live. Hi, everybody. My first time doing a stream. Oh, so I can see. Okay, so we got six up in the top. Hey, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well tonight. So if you want to communicate with me at all during the presentation, please just use the chat feature up on the side. I'll have that open. So I'll be hearing, I'll be able to take your comments or questions. Or if you just want to say hi. Hi. I'm going to wait a few minutes. Or so to let everybody, to let a few people get in. And then we'll get started. Hello. So think about the lights in this basement at nighttime. They always seem to be quite bright. Always seem to be a little bit warm. When I will do my Zoom lectures tomorrow, my 4 hours of Zoom lectures tomorrow, I won't feel that hot. But for some reason, at nighttime when these lights are on in the basement, figure that one out. I hope I can provide some answers. I like how it's phrased in the form of a question there. I look forward to learning about the book from you. Well, if I can't teach you something about it, then thank you. This one was a long time in the making. It's quite the journey. From an idea to something that you can actually, here we go, something you can hold. I can never get the direction right when I'm on webcam. It's always the opposite, just like a mirror, right? But pretty amazing to think about the journey, from an idea that I had hatched. I like it better with the question mark. I'm not going to lie. I don't mind being thrown for a curve. No, I was just saying it's really remarkable to be sitting here, full circle. I'm not even really sure about the release date or when it's going to be in stores or when it's being delivered, if it's something that you've already pre-ordered or ordered. But on the University of Toronto Press website, that's the publisher for the book, November 7th was the date that they listed as the official launch date or the official publication date or the official on sale date. So I figured it would be kind of fun just for me to talk a little bit about the book that I've written, this long intellectual journey that I've taken. My gosh, I conceived of this project. This, for those who don't know, this was my dissertation project. And I entered into my PhD studies in January of 2012. So this idea was percolating and brewing in my mind all the way up, for a few months or even a year or so, even before that. So this is really about a decade in the making in terms of the idea, crafting it, finishing it in terms of it being a dissertation, adapting it into a full-length book, pitching it to university presses, getting it accepted, and then going through one heck of a grueling peer review session a peer review process in order to get this thing out there. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I want to thank. I mean, if you've got the book, it's got a lengthy acknowledgement section. There's too many people really to thank in terms of helping me along this journey. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm simply going to give you a little bit of a taste of what you're going to find in the book. It's an interesting topic in terms of Lord Stanley's political motivation to donate the Stanley Cup, but the text itself is it's quite dense in terms of the argumentation, in terms of the content, in terms of the information and the knowledge, and I think that's a testament to the amount of research and the amount of work that I've put into crafting this. So what I want to do tonight for everybody is just give you a little bit of a walkthrough from my perspective, the major takeaways, the major arguments in the book, what you're likely to find when you crack open your copy of Canada's Holy Grail. So without further ado, what I'm going to do, and I apologize if I might actually get a little bit emotional here. I'm not really sure. I actually haven't read from my own book before. And what I'm going to do is I want to read to you the first 2 pages of the introduction, because that really will set the stage for letting you know what the book is about in terms of its more particular arguments. So I'm really not sure how this is going to go. I might shed a tear here. Let's see. This is pretty wild. I'm not going to lie. Okay. Didn't really think, there was a time where I didn't think that this would even happen in terms of this book being published and made. So this is quite something. Okay. On 7 February 2006, Gad Shelley, David Burt, and the National Hockey League agreed to an out-of-court settlement. The 2 Toronto lawyers sued the league over the custodianship of the league's most important symbol, its championship trophy, the Stanley Cup. Writing in the Kingston Whig Standard regarding the settlement, journalist Steve Irwin declared that, quote, "The Stanley has won the right to free agency." The ruling stipulated what Shelley and Burt suspected. The NHL legally borrows the cup, but does not own it. Edmonton lawyer Rod Payne argued during the 2004-2005 lockout that the 6th Governor General of Canada, Lord Stanley, donated the cup in 1892 to the people of Canada, represented by their ice hockey clubs across the Dominion. The third stipulation laid out by Lord Stanley in the original trust read that, quote, "The cup is to remain a challenge cup and not to become the property of any team, even if won more than once." End quote. When Stanley left the country in 1893 to become the 16th Earl of Derby, he bequeathed the governance of the cup to 2 hand-picked trustees, Philip Dankskin Ross and Sheriff John Sweetland. Stanley's original intent led Shelley and Burt to file a lawsuit on behalf of Canadian citizens to reclaim the cup. Their lawyer, Todd Gilbert, argued that the trustees lacked the legal authority to broker a deal with the NHL in 1947 to hand over custodianship to the NHL. The settlement clarified the legal status of the cup. It also allowed the trustees to award the cup in the event of another canceled season. What compelled Shelley and Burt to sue the NHL over the Stanley Cup? Why was it important for them to elucidate legally that the NHL merely borrows the cup from the people of Canada? Why did they use Stanley's original intent as evidence against the NHL? Shelley contended, Shelley and Burt, decided that there was merit to the lawsuit, and that your average Canadian doesn't want the Stanley Cup, put away and hidden just because of a commercial dispute in a professional hockey league. End quote. He argued that for Canadians, the Stanley Cup represents more than a symbol of professional ice hockey supremacy. It was a strong cultural marker of Canadianness. Where did the strong connection between the cup and Canadian identity begin? Did it emerge with the advent of radio and television? Is it a symptom of Canadian insecurity regarding the Americanization of the game? Did the connection begin with when the first professionals began competing for the cup in 1908? Or was that trophy already imbued with Canadian nationalist meanings when Stanley donated it? In this book, I argue that the meaning it holds originated in Stanley himself. His act of donating the cup proved one of strong nationalism. This is affirmed by his original letter explaining why he was donating a championship cup to promote ice hockey across the country. At a banquet for the three-time champion Ottawa Hockey Club, held at the Russell House Hotel in Ottawa on 18 March 1892, Stanley's aide-de-camp Lord Kilcorsey rose and read Lord Stanley's intentions. As reported in the Ottawa Journal, the letter read, "I have for some time been thinking that it would be a good thing if there were a Challenge Cup, which should be held from year to year by the champion ice hockey team in the Dominion. There does not appear to be any such outward sign of a championship at present, and considering the general interest which matches now elicit, and the importance of having the game played fairly and under rules generally recognized, I am willing to give a cup which shall be held from year to year by the winning team. I am not quite certain that the present regulations governing the arrangement of matches give entire satisfaction, and it would be worth considering whether they could not be arranged that each team would play once at home and once at the place where their opponents hail from." Lord Stanley donated the cup in order to stimulate ice hockey competition among all parts of the Dominion. He hoped to harness the sport's popularity for nationalist purposes, and that holding championship games on a home-and-home basis would promote travel across the country. Donating the cup was an attempt on his part to build a nation through sport. Given that, as Governor General, he was head of the Canadian state, his act was political. Setting aside that he had a personal interest in ice hockey and desired to promote it, the creation of the Stanley Cup had political implications. That was really fun. Thanks. Okay. So I don't want to go over too great of detail. One, because there's lots of that in the book for you to find. What I want to do is to spend about 15, maybe 20 minutes or so talking to you about why I decided to write the book, what sort of animated me, what animated the research, what motivated me, why the cup as this unit of study for a historian. I'm going to outline the three basic arguments of the book because that's how the book is organized also sectionally. There's three sections and they each relate to three of these arguments. And then I'll close with some concluding thoughts about the idea of national sports, since that's what the book is really about. Okay. So why this book? I've always been somebody who's been fascinated by the nexus or the connection or the intersection between sport and politics. And I started to really get interested in this idea, thinking about why do some countries have their identities bound in certain sports? Why is the Brazilian identity so tied up in soccer, and not just soccer, but in a certain samba style, or a small island country like New Zealand so tied in with the sport of rugby? And certainly in Canada, we have the sport of hockey, right? And it's ever present. And this is something that is it's hard to ignore in Canadian culture. I think it's Ken Dryden that says, if you try to ignore it, you're simply I'm not going to butcher it. Ken Dryden's got a great line about how millions are imbued in the game, and if you try to ignore it, you're simply swimming against the current in Canadian society. And so I've always wanted to understand why we had this strong connection to this particular sport in this country, as seemingly not just something that we use to express ourselves, but as certainly something that other people around the world latch onto and identify us with. So I always wanted to know, how did this historically emerge? How did this develop? What were the leading, who were the leading figures? What were the important moments? And there's something about the cup, I think, that people always gravitate towards it. And that led me down the path of thinking about this connection between sport and national identity in a bit of a deeper way than historians and even most theorists have thought about it. And I was able to actually come up with my own idea. It's called nationalized sport. So a national sport is a sport that represents a people or represents a nationality. Nationalized sport is something deeper. When you play a nationalized sport, you actually become more of the nationality that that sport represents. So rather than hockey representing Canada, when you play hockey, you actually become more Canadian. That's the difference. And I've never seen anybody in the academy who wanted to tackle these issues in the way that I did. And in specifics, fusing sport, intellectual, and political history into one coherent narrative. I was either commended or chastised by my PhD committee for not writing enough about sport in a sport history dissertation topic. I haven't really satisfied the sport historians or the political historians or the intellectual historians, because what I've done is tried to force them all into one narrative together. And this isn't something that a lot of people do in the academy, but it's something that I wanted to do. And I think one of the reasons why the book was published is because of this unique contribution to the scholarship. But why the cup? You know, when I told people about my initial ideas about writing this dissertation and about publishing this book, everybody thought it was a great idea because they naturally associate the Stanley Cup with the essence of Canada or as representative of Canada. And when you actually think about it deeply, it's the most uniquely Canadian cultural symbol in existence. It's a Canadian trophy, right? It made in England, but donated in Canada, made for Canadians, for a sport that was created in Canada. Hockey was invented in 1875 in Montreal and idolized by the Canadian population. But even further, internationally, hockey is the one thing that Canadians are known to have given the world and also to be excellent at. It's probably the only thing that we've done where we're both of those, the originators and perhaps the greatest practitioners of any cultural activity. So hockey really does have this oversized influence in who we are, both what we tell ourselves and what other people see in us. And oftentimes this is shrouded or concealed in its contemporary position as a, the trophy for the National Hockey League, the world's preeminent premier professional hockey league, right? And it's given to teams in the United States. You know, the last time a Canadian team won was 1993. Even though many Canadians win the Stanley Cup and they bring it back, there's still like this feeling that we're missing out in Canada, that we've lost something and that we need to regain it in terms of having one of our teams win this cup and bring it back. And there's been this unique history, and my book is not necessarily a history of the Stanley Cup, right? It's a history of the person who donated the Stanley Cup. But what's interesting is I started off this presentation, I started off the book with the story of this lawsuit from the lockout season, right? Where these two lawyers decided to sue the NHL because they clearly weren't going to give the cup out. But Canadians had this strong attachment to it. And what most people don't know is that the cup existed in its first 25 years as the National Hockey Championship of Canada, right? The Dominion Challenge Hockey Cup. And teams from across the country would petition these trustees, the ones I was mentioning at the beginning, to be, I guess, worthy of playing for this Canadian national championship in ice hockey. Now, in 1947, the NHL engineered a coup. The trustees signed over custodianship of the cup so that the NHL could use it for licensing and for promotions and for marketing. So the NHL has the exclusive right to market the Stanley Cup. But the lawsuit in 2006 really brought to light that this was never the trustees to give away. They actually gave away something they didn't have the legal right to, because Lord Stanley donated it to the people of Canada as represented by their hockey teams, with the trustees to look over it. And the NHL actually admitted this in the 2006 settlement. And in the case, if there's a future lockout and there's no Stanley Cup being awarded, it's actually going to be awarded to a Canadian team, maybe to the top college team or to the top amateur team, but it will come back and it will be awarded next time because it's ours. And so there's two premises that guide the main arguments of the book. The first is that the donation of the Stanley Cup is partially motivated by Canadian national politics, centered on national identity creation. And the second is that since it is partially political, the donation serves as one potential solution to the problem of Canadian national unity identity at the time period. So there's two basic ideas that guided my research, and I was able to shift those two major premises into three arguments. Now, in the book, at the table of contents, you'll see I've got three sections. Section 1, the national. Section 2, the personal. Section 3, the international. And the reason it's presented that way in the book is because the national is your context. That's the context of Canada in 1888. That's the context of what national sports are in the 19th century on the eve of the donation of the Stanley Cup. But today, I'm going to go through the personal and then the national and then the political. I think that's the better way to present it. And so in order to prove my two premises, I had to come up with a rather intricate argument, and that's sort of interlocking throughout the book. The first relates off of a personal interpretation of Lord Stanley himself. Was Stanley's donation based on political ideas and utility? Like, can it actually be proven or made plausible that Lord Stanley would have donated this in this way? So what I had to do in the book is establish both his personal politics, so trying to get into his mind politically, and then argue that he actually acted on them genuinely and legitimately when he donated the cup. Then there's the national stream of interpretation. How did the donation fit into the national debates about identity? It doesn't make good sense for Lord Stanley to do this if it's not in the context of it being necessary, in terms of there needing to be some sort of a solution to issues related to Canadian national identity at this time. And that sport, and in particular an ice hockey championship, could actually fill the void, could be a solution. So I have to establish that sport was a legitimate avenue to create this national identity for Canadian politicians and intellectuals, because these two groups, these two class of people, were the ones who were really pushing the idea of Canadian national identity out into the public consciousness at this time period. And then finally, there's an international realm or a political realm to all this argumentation. Why is it necessary to have a strong national identity in the first place? And why is sport something that can fulfill this? How did the donation fit into intellectual debates regarding nationality and identity? And what I've done with this stream of interpretation is establish that national sport identity emerged as a contextual idea in the late 19th century out of larger transformations in liberal ideology in Great Britain, the United States, and in Canada. And so I can use Lord Stanley himself to track all of this, which is really interesting as a historical study. So let me just quickly go over it. I'll try and keep my comments short because I can go down about a million tangents. But as I say, there's lots of all the detail is in the book, and I'm happy to answer a few questions after as well. But I don't want to get sucked into being into full professor mode here as well either. I've got enough Zoom lectures tomorrow. I can do that then. Okay, so first off, Lord Stanley and the donation. I have to prove that this would make political sense to Lord Stanley. Lord Stanley was born into a political home. He was the son of Edward Geoffrey Stanley. He's the founder of the modern Conservative Party and the longest party leader in modern Great British political history. He was the first three-time prime minister as well in Great Britain. And what's very intriguing about Edward Geoffrey Stanley is that he was a traditional conservative, but he had liberal leanings for the time period. So he was kind of an idiosyncratic and a unique politician. To give you some examples, he was the prime minister who passed the Reform Act of 1867. This effectively doubled the amount of people who could vote. Not the most conservative at the time. not the most conservative idea. He was also in charge of negotiating the end of slavery in the colonies in 1833 when he was an MP. And Lord Stanley, Frederick Stanley, the son, followed his father into politics. He was a conservative MP for over 20 years. He was a cabinet member serving in a number of different administrations. He served most frequently in service of war, but also as the colonial secretary, as you can see in 1885 to 1886. This brought him into direct contact with Canada, because at this time Canada was still it's a dominion or part of the colonial possessions. And what's interesting about Lord Stanley Frederick, Arthur Stanley, the son, is that he's also a traditional conservative, but he has liberal leanings, but he's different than his father. And what's different about him than his father is that liberal ideology is different at this time period. When Edward Jeffrey Stanley is in Parliament, it's classical liberalism, which is the dominant liberal strain. When Frederick Arthur Stanley is in Parliament, it's progressive liberalism or new liberalism or collective liberalism. Now, in the book, I show how Lord Stanley, Frederick Arthur Stanley, acted upon these. One of the major policies that he supported was organized emigration, for one example. As a way to solve the pauper problem, or as a way to solve the poverty problem in the UK. And this sort of positions us into the international, or into the political sphere in terms of the interpretation, because Lord Stanley's personal politics was of progressivism. He was a conservative, but he was not the kind of conservative that looks backwards in time. The conservatives of the late 19th century were progressives in the sense of they believed in a future-oriented mindset. They believed in the power of progress, as represented by science and technology and expertise and rationality and bureaucracy and organization. And he was very much a supporter of energetic state action in the service of nationality. One of the things that he supported in the UK was municipal socialism, which is this idea, right? It's not sort of like left-wing socialism in terms of like national or international, but more so just on the local level in terms of like churches and charitable organizations working alongside municipal governments. Now, what's interesting is that sport is a progressive social technology. So the progressives, the liberal progressives and the conservative progressives, used sport to solve problems in society. For the liberals or left-wing progressives, it was to solve the problems of industrialism, right? The poor working conditions, the poor living conditions of the working poor, the factory workers in the city. For conservatives, it was to solve the crisis of masculinity, to ensure strong soldiers, to ensure strong political leaders, and to push forward national ideas. But both of these progressive groups use sport. And so this lets us understand that the cup is a progressive social technology, right? A technology is like a fancy word for problem solving, right? So a social technology is something that's used to solve social problems, right? So the cup is a progressive social technology aimed at fostering Canadian identity during a time of Canadian national crisis. So Lord Stanley, in his role of Governor General, acted within his political purview and on his own political beliefs to solve a problem related to the national identity crisis. Is there a national identity crisis going on in the late 19th century in Canada? The answer is yes, yes, yes. 5-alarm fire. Why? What's going on in Canada that makes us insecure at this time period? We're generally not a very secure people in the best of times when it comes to our national identity. This time period when Lord Stanley is serving as the Governor General, right, the Queen's representative, the highest ranking political officer in the land, it's not a great time for Canada. The 19th century theory of nationalism, and this is the sort of the international intellectual current that is suggesting that everybody needs to have a strong nation. Nation means shared history, shared religion, shared language, shared custom, shared government, etc. But the government has to rest upon this nation. The state can only be as powerful as the nation that supports it. And Canada is not a traditional nation. We are wed together from multiple histories. We have different religions, different languages, different cultures, different history. One section of the country is conquered. If you're thinking about the French over the French conquered by the English, and the French conquered the indigenous, right? And so we've always had this division between us. We don't have anything that really unites us. And so if a state can only be as strong as the nation that undergirds it, and Canada is this new state without a strong nation, well, can it even survive? Because what it meant to be a Canadian in the late 19th century was really to be in between two of the big nations, the two biggest nations in the world, and particularly these English-speaking behemoths, the United Kingdom, the British Empire, and the United States. And Canada is right in between. We're literally like right in between them in almost everything. And Lord Stanley, his experience as the Governor General of Canada proves this to him. He has to negotiate on behalf of Canada, but he realizes that the British government is selling them out for American interests, and that the Americans are intransigent and a little bit hostile to the Canadians. The major idea in Canada around the time of the donation of the Stanley Cup is that Canada is not going to be a country. It's not going to be a country in the future. It's going to be annexed by the United States, or it's going to be folded back into the British Empire in some sort of a grander imperial federation. What Lord Stanley understands through his work as the Governor General is that there's no political solution to Canadian national identity. There's no bringing the French and the English together. There's no bringing the Maritimes and the West and the prairies together and the central Canada together. The regional differences, the linguistic differences, they're too great. There has to be something bigger than politics. There has to be something cultural that can unite us. This is where sport comes in. I've mentioned, right, that sport is already part of the progressive panoply or the progressive toolkit in terms of being a social technology. And it's already being used to define national identity in the two major leading countries at the time, Great Britain and the United States. Great Britain, the first to give us a sense of national and nationalized sports with cricket. The United States, the next to follow with baseball. And what's very intriguing is that sport actually creates this strong identity bond between Canada and the United Kingdom. Sport travels through the British officer class, through the people who come and are stationed in Canada and give us the games of the British Empire. But the games of the British Empire don't really work in the Canadian environment. It doesn't work to play cricket in a land with winter 6 months of the year. It's also not the gentle-natured British countryside. And the people who come to Canada are more egalitarian, they're more rough, they're more American than the British. So we need a sport that represents that. We need a sport that represents this mix of American and British, the wild of the environment and the civil of our organization. And there's no greater representation of that than ice hockey. It represents these ideas of Canadian national identity that were important and salient and influential at the time. Ice hockey is hardy. It's rough. We all know about the fighting. We all know about the winter. We know about the dedication and the grit that's needed to play this game. But it's also orderly and gentlemanly. It doesn't seem like it, but it's got rules. It has standards. It's got a code of conduct, right? And unlike lacrosse, which had all of those things, it's played in the winter, which more accurately expresses what it's like to live in Canada in terms of, pardon me, what it's like to live here. What can express the experience of having to all live in this land together? Something that transcends those political differences, right? And Lord Stanley is the Queen's representative. So ice hockey doesn't have the greatest reputation. It's not a very old sport. It's becoming popular. But when Lord Stanley says, basically gives it the Queen's seal of approval, the sport just it takes off and becomes immensely popular. So the donation provides royal assent of a cultural product to serve as a national identifier. Now, this wouldn't be possible at all if there wasn't a larger transformation in the way people are thinking about the idea of what it means to essentially be a liberal in English-speaking society. And the debates over Canada's future direction in terms of, are we going to be a country that is folded into the British Empire? Are we going to become Americanized? Because there's a small minority of people that actually believe Canada will be its own country moving into the 20th century. So congrats, we made it, everybody. But during the crossroads of this sort of late 1880s, early 1890s, right? This is the time period when Lord Stanley is Governor General. This is an intense period of debate within Canada, and in particular between these two intellectuals that I've got up top here, and they're featured in the book, George Parkin with the mustache and Goldwin Smith with the mutton chops. George Parkin, he is a proponent of imperial federation. That's the larger British Empire. Goldwin Smith, he is a proponent of annexation of Canada into the United States. So they kind of give us the two bookends. And we also have this really intense 1891 election between Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Sir John A. Macdonald, which is very close, but Sir Wilfrid Laurier runs on unrestricted reciprocity or free trade with the United States. He's branded as a potential traitor, wants to essentially just join the U.S., and Sir John A. Macdonald carries the day with the old flag, the old policy, protectionism, and this notion of imperial preference. And so what this is showing us is that even in the Canadian sort of population, they're grappling hard with these ideas. And Lord Stanley is clearly on one side. He is on the side of the Conservatives. He's actually good friends with Sir John A. Macdonald, and they have a really lengthy and personal correspondence with each other. And again, we get this sense that the Conservatives in Canada at this time are not sort of traditional Conservatives. They're these progressive Conservatives, right? They're forward-looking. They are interested in science, technology, rationalization, bureaucratization, national promotion. And Parkin and Macdonald and Stanley are all kind of in the same boat together. And one of the things that you see in the book is this sort of idea of imperial federation, but also friendship with Sir John A. Macdonald. And this gives us the sense that even these conservatives, right, have transformed their ideas about using sport, this new kind of social technology, to represent these old, ancient, national qualities. And there's this notion that it's proper and good for the state to do this. And it's not just on the conservative side, but it's also on the liberal side. So the classical liberals of the first half of the 19th century, this is in the British context, your Richard Bright, your Richard Cobden, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the end of slavery, those types of things, free trade. By the late 19th century, they are no longer in power. The people who call themselves liberals, they are the progressives. State energy is in, both in terms of culture, but also in terms of economic planning. Liberals are now interested in central economic planning when they haven't been in the first half of the 19th century. Classical liberalism just doesn't exist. And so anybody who's calling themselves a liberal is really using this idea of a collective notion of identity as opposed to an individualized notion. And when nobody is thinking about the individual, everybody is thinking about the collective. And this means that national identity is on everybody's minds. And this means, right, that the state now can be justified to be energetic to manage national affairs, whereas The classical liberal idea of the state is that it only exists to safeguard individual liberty. But by the turn of the 20th century, nobody believes this, at least in terms of mainstream political ideology. And so sport becomes part of both the left and a right strategy in animating a national existence or proclaiming a national identity. And for Canada, this country without a national sense of itself, well, sport just filled the bill. Without this change in political thought, which I track in the sort of the last two chapters of the book, the environment which gave us the donation would not exist. And as historians, what we do is we contextualize the past. We make understandable the environments in which events occur. And it makes no sense for somebody to donate a sports trophy to proclaim a national identity without this larger transformation in thought, which basically had everybody on the same page regarding the state being a positive actor on behalf of generating national identity or national characteristics. So let me finish this off, and then I'll take some questions if anybody has any. And thanks everybody for your attendance and again, just celebrating this special time for me with the publishing of this book, which I thought would never happen. What's the historical lesson, says the historian? The first one is sport's a serious topic of study in political and intellectual history. What I wanted to do is I wanted to force political and intellectual historians to grapple with the idea of sport seriously. And I think I've done that. And I'm very proud of that contribution to scholarship. My big thesis after studying this for many years is that Canadian identity without sport does not exist. That might sound a bit brash, but I don't think it does, because we don't have anything that divides us. And when I say Canadian identity, what I mean is a positive sense of Canadian identity. Canadians are great at telling everybody what we're not. We're not this, we're not that. We're certainly not Americans. We'll never let anybody forget that we're not Americans, right? But when it comes to what are we that differentiates us out from all the other countries in the world, what is it? What do we have? Hockey, the cup, these are the best symbols that we have of our uniqueness, of something that's different, of something that binds us together, something that we know ourselves from, and that other people around the world know ourselves. It may seem superficial, but if it can animate us into a community of sentiment with each other, well, then it may not be so superficial or may not be so silly. And then finally, the use of liberal language is often used to promote illiberal goals. Just because people call themselves liberals and promote the idea of liberalism, individual rights, human rights, dignity of the individual, doesn't mean that they do. The liberals of the late 19th century took a great idea and they sullied it. These were the people who gave us scientific racism. They gave us the resuscitation of imperialism and a scientific racialized imperialism at that. These are the people that banned essentially women from participating in sport due to scientific ideas on their biological fitness. And what it means is we sometimes lose the true meaning and the true value of sport, something that's very close to my heart. Right? Because the original idea of sport, as it was spread in the beginning half of the 19th century, that it was something that was used to ennoble our individual character. But over time, it became important to ennoble the collective ideal of national identity. And we should always be aware of where the collective ideal can lead us, because we may say we're for rights and freedoms, but just like the liberals of the late 19th century, yeah, they didn't actually believe it, and they didn't act on it. So that's maybe our final takeaway. Okay, so thanks everybody. Merci. I really appreciate your attendance again and participation in coming to this celebration of a book talk with me. I've got I mentioned that I've got some signed copies I want to give away. If you just want to, in the chat, if you are interested in one of the signed copies, leave me your email, and then I'll see how many I have, and then I'll be in contact with you regarding mailing information. So just put your email down in the chat there, and I can and I'll send you some information. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so if anybody's got any questions, so yeah, that's it. So thanks everybody. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna keep this picture up because it's a beautiful picture of Maurice Richard and Jean Beliveau holding the Stanley Cup. So who doesn't love that? I did many academic presentations along the way in academic conferences, and this was the picture I showed to end every single one. So it's kind of romantic. Okay, so I think there's yeah, that's right, Matt. Not only am I saying that the stereotype is correct and historically justified, but I think it's a good thing because it's a positive way for us to be in communion together as Canadians. And that's kind of what I've come to learn regarding this cup, this sport, and this country, and the powerful ideas that kind of shape us. So yeah, that's my contention, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, so if anybody has a question, please just put it in the chat, and I'm happy to. Thanks, Rachel. I'm glad you're learning. And again, there's lots of context that was missing, and as a historian, like, not providing context is what's the word I'm looking for? Sacrilegious. Like, it really pains me. I gave my students extra additional contact lectures that they didn't actually have to read. They didn't have to. But boy, context is something else. Yeah, you're welcome, James. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the comment. I'm glad I could help share that a little bit with us, with you. I really appreciate the kind words. Pure coincidence, yeah. I also consider Maurice Richard he's like the patron saint of hockey, and Jean Beliveau is the king of hockey, like, in terms of their characters. So, and you'll find that to be also historically justified. All right. Anybody have any question regarding what I said? Anything I could clear up, or that wasn't able to, or something you missed, or maybe something I can share, a favorite story or something? I could talk forever about the book. I'd rather not. It's one of those things, like, I had given up on this project because of the amount of peer review it had to go through. I went through 5 years of peer review, which is not normal. It's extraordinarily long and grueling. And about 2 years ago, I had given up. I'd left this for dead. You're welcome. You're welcome, Mark. I thank you so much for tuning in. I'm glad you learned something. The waves of immigration as a unifying feature. Yes. So it's kind of an interesting time period, because hockey is used similarly to the way that baseball was used in America as an assimilation tool. And we didn't have very large waves of immigration until after hockey was already sort of established as a national sport. Thinking about the early 20th century, and especially out on the prairies. One of the things that we see in the early 20th century is more of a regional dispersion of hockey playing. So coming out of the 19th century, Central Canada is really like the hockey playing mecca, right? The game is created in Montreal. It's really popularized in Ottawa and Kingston. Like, those are the 3 cities that are the main hockey cities in Canada. You know, even a place like Toronto, they're not really even playing hockey until the late 1890s and even into the 1900s. But teams from the West, so teams from Winnipeg, teams from what will become Saskatchewan and Alberta, they're still the Northwest Territory even at that point. Hockey is useful, and this was actually one of the expressed ideas of Lord Stanley in making it a Challenge Cup. He wanted it to be a home and home series, so he wanted teams to have to travel across the country. He was the first Governor General to actually travel all the way across the country because the Canadian Pacific Railroad, the railroad that unites Canada from coast to coast, wasn't finished until 1885, and the previous Governor General didn't make it out to British Columbia. So Lord Stanley in 1889 takes a train trip all the way out to British Columbia and back, and this really impresses upon him the geographic immensity of the country, but also the idea that culture can bind them, that can bind people together, and that through travel and through doing the same thing together, we can actually become more of a country. Yes. So it's interesting how that works. Fighting was absolutely part of the sport, had to be in it. The very first written account of hockey actually talks about there being a fisticuffs involved and somebody breaking a bench over somebody else's head. So it's great. You're welcome. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, friend. Fighting's always been part of it. Fighting is actually a link to this might actually tie a little bit into what Rachel's saying. Fighting is actually a link to both side of working class culture, but also to the Stoic Indigenous culture that existed. The Canadian ideal of masculinity was patterned off of the Indigenous ideal of masculinity that they found here. They thought that the Indigenous who lived here were the most physically gifted, superior, strong race of people that had ever that walked upon the earth, and they respected them tremendously for that physicality. And so the game of lacrosse was sort of codified out of the sort of the violent game of lacrosse that was played by many different Indigenous tribes all up and down the eastern seaboard of Canada and the United States. Now they stripped away a lot of the religious meanings of lacrosse, but sort of that physicality, that bravado, that bragging style, that stoicism of not showing fighting through pain, that's sort of a legacy of the Indigenous that's actually been birthed into or created into Canadian sport. There's no coincidence that both in hockey and lacrosse, it's not illegal to fight. You just simply go to the penalty box and cool down for a few minutes. And hockey, you're fighting on skates, right? But lacrosse, you're just on shoes, like punching each other in the face. And every other sport that's not a combat sport, you get tossed out immediately. But in the two national Canadian sports, you're allowed to fight, right? So it has to relate to that hardiness, that hardy culture, but also to Indigenous notions of masculinity, which the Canadian type was modeled off of. Rachel, yeah. So in my book, and I make a specific mention of this at the beginning, I'm presenting from Lord Stanley's perspective, which is a hermetically sealed perspective. So it's only going to be one perspective. And also this idea of consensus, like a national identity by definition is a consensus position, a consensus identity. So I don't really get into a lot of the marginalized groups, especially the Indigenous, but also the French in Canada. Their story's not here, because when you're talking about driving towards a consensus, by definition, it is to exclude other voices. And there's tons of stuff in the Canadian literature that already talks about that. So my book's a little bit different. But if you're interested in some of that literature, there's a lot of it. Just message me. I can turn you on to a lot of that stuff. But certainly this notion of like the drive to create one identity by definition destroys alternative identities in its wake, right? And so certainly that's something that happened with the Indigenous. Although there's some interesting stuff about Lord Stanley and the Indigenous. The Indigenous and the British Crown have actually always had fairly good relations in Canada. It wasn't until the creation of the federal government, the Canadian state, in 1867, and then the creation of the horrifying Indian Act in 1876, which I believe is the worst piece of legislation ever passed in this country. It's the most horrific thing that's ever been passed in this country legislatively. That's actually been a lot of the issues in Canada and the Indigenous, is between the federal government and Indigenous tribes. The British Crown was actually quite good and respectful of the Indigenous tribes beforehand. And some of that history is a little bit in there. Hopefully I got a little bit of what you're asking there, Rachel. Yes, Mark, it absolutely is. And that's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to investigate, is because people just associate it as a professional trophy, right? And they assume that it's the NHL's trophy. The NHL awards it, so it must be the NHL, but it's not. The NHL came into existence in 1917, a full 25 years after the Stanley Cup was even created. And the Stanley Cup was competed solely by amateurs for the first 15 years of its existence. It wasn't until 1908 that professionals even got to compete for the cup. So we've lost that sense of national identity through the Stanley Cup. And you may sort of know about the Allen Cup as well, right? So the Allen Cup at one point was actually more important than the Stanley Cup for Canadian national identity, because the NHL was professional teams in the United States, and the Allen Cup, for those who don't know, the Allen Cup is for the amateur senior hockey championship in Canada. And for a lot of cities, and certainly for the entire western half of Canada, the Allen Cup was more important than the Stanley Cup. And so, yeah, it certainly had lost that meaning. But I think you still see it creeping through, in the sense that we still want a Canadian team to win, or when the lockout is happening, people are trying to rescue it and to make sure that a Canadian university team can hoist the Stanley Cup. You know, we have a little bit of a legacy. We've got a bit of it's a bit of an aura around the cup in Canada. You know, it means a little bit. We know it means more than just what the NHL has to say about it, even though it is just is only awarded by the NHL. So it's a little bit tricky. We certainly don't have the full historical understanding, but I think there's this gut feeling in Canadians that the cup just means more. It just means more to us. And I think that this is why. Thank you. I think that's my uncle Mark. Thank you. Can you comment on your scripture short as a social technology? Sure thing. So this is actually an adaptation of philosopher Martin Heidegger's idea of technology, right? That technology is simply something that solves problems. So sport in the 19th century was marshaled to solve problems. So it is a social technology, and it still operates that way today. But in the 19th century, when sport was re-emerging after, oh my gosh, like over 1,000 years of basically being non-existent in Western society. In the 19th century, it was really grabbed upon by the public health movement. So if you know of the temperance movement, for example, right, the people in the 19th century who were very interested in banning alcohol and banning the drinking of alcohol, and they were successful in that in terms of the 19th Amendment in the United States. They use sport as a way to solve the problems of industrialism, for one. So this would be the progressives, the urban progressives. So they would go into a neighborhood, like a tenement neighborhood, where everyone was a factory worker, and they would say, build a playground. This is where the playground movement came from, right? Building parks in the city, Frederick Law Olmsted, right? Building Central Park. This notion that physical activity and green space is necessary for a healthy person, right? So sport was also used to create bonds between strangers in the city. So you've got billions of people streaming in from the farms, right? The Industrial Revolution is uprooting life. People are streaming in to the factories, but you've got all these single young men and single young women, right, who don't know anybody in the city. They can be tempted and lured into disreputable leisure time activity. So sport becomes marshaled to positive leisure in the sense of like the best example would be something like the YMCA, right? Where you've got, prayer, you've got religious teachings, but then you've also got athletics, sports, physical activity, gymnastics, as a way to create community, create fraternity, and create bonds in the inhuman, alienating city, but also in a positive sense. So that's a few ways in which sport would be used as a social technology, particularly within the 19th century. But there's many more ways in which we can think of sport as being used as a tool of social technology. In Canada, sport is used as a social technology for unification. And the way we can see this is we are not a very patriotic people. We're not a flag wearing people. There's very few times when everybody in Canada is cheering on Canada in the same thing for all at the same time, except for when the Olympics are on or when it's international sporting competition. We have no problem waving our flags, painting our faces, putting on all the red and white, right? This allows us to be brought into communion with each other. We're now cheering for the same people at the same time. Even when we're hockey fans, we're divided. Toronto, Montreal, like Calgary, Edmonton, right? But when it's the flag and when it's sport, this is when Canadians really shine through in terms of being proud of ourselves and proud of our identity. And this is something that we've historically done, not just through hockey and not just like in the last few Olympic Games since we have had owned the podium. And Stephen Harper said it was okay for us to feel patriotic because we were hosting the Olympics in 2010. But it's something that's historically consistent throughout our history. So that would be some ways in which sport could be thought of as a social technology, and social technology in the Heideggerian sense of simply being a problem solving, something to solve a problem. So we understand like physical technology, right? Machines and that type of technology, but technology can be broadened in an understanding, or at least Heidegger thinks that. So I hope that answers your question, and I'm pretty sure that's my Uncle Mark. So that's great. Do you think there could ever be another national symbol in sport on par for Canada? No. It would have to be something that's historically, I think it's something that's historically, it's contextual. So it came about at a time when it was needed, and at a time when hockey was just about, when hockey was making this transition into Canada's national sport. Like one of the very first like public and popular books about hockey that sort of talked about the rules and where it came from was written in 1899 by a man named Arthur Farrell, and he was a Stanley Cup champion. He played for the Montreal Shamrocks. That's a really interesting team, by the way. That's the working class Irish team from Montreal who were known for fighting everybody and being the most violent team, because they didn't care about the middle class sensibilities of being a respectable amateur. They just wanted to win, and win they did. But he wrote a book in 1899 called Hockey, Canada's Royal Winter Game. So, I mean, it just shows you that's like 6 years after the cup was donated. And it already had created that sort of lore and that legacy and that idea and that bond between Canadians and the sport and the cup that represents it and them. So no, I don't think so. But then again, I'm the wrong person to ask when it comes to that. Some other historian of some other sport might have some other idea about it, but they would be wrong in the Canadian context. I would. That's the argument I would make. Okay, great questions, everybody. Thanks so much again for your attendance and these great questions. If there's anything else, I'm happy to answer it. If not, 9:00 was about the time I wanted to end this. Yeah, but I'm happy to, if people have ideas or questions, I'm happy to talk. Keep thinking of lacrosse, which was the first organized sport. I wonder if it was considered. Okay, so I really go over this in the book. It was the first thing that was thought of. So in 1867, on the Day of Confederation on July 1st, the rules of lacrosse were published in every single newspaper in Canada. This was not by coincidence. One of the players in the book is named George Beers, and he is the Canada's first sport nationalist, the first person to try and tie Canadian national identity to and through a sport, and he did it with the sport of lacrosse, which he argued was the best field game and the greatest representation of Canadian national character. For those ideas that I sort of already outlined and sketched a little bit, the idea of the mix between the wild and the civil. Yeah. If you're in the book, it's going to be in the national. So, gosh, I'm just trying to get the pages. This is hilarious. Enshrining the national. So in that massive chapter 2, that's where I document, and physicality. Yeah. That's where I document the creation of national sports in Great Britain, its adaptation in the United States, and then its experience in Canada. So lacrosse, yeah, it's linked to the Indigenous, which means it's linked to the hardy settler attitude. It's organized and genteel, so it's refined and civilized. It's not like the untamed game of the Indigenous, which is not really a sport. It's an all-encompassing cultural activity that's religious, it's economic, it's social, it's political. The game is irregular. It's played in different ways amongst different peoples in different locations. Sometimes it will be played amongst a field that is wild, miles and miles long, with hundreds and hundreds of people, and it goes days. Sometimes it's in a small field with, a couple of dozen, but it's always vicious and it's always violent when it comes to the Indigenous variant of lacrosse. And so what Beers did was he put lines around the field, said this many people have to stand on it at all times. This is the equipment that they use. Here are the positions. This is how long we're going to play. And sort of this notion of civilizing the wild. And that's sort of the notion of the Canadian colonial experience, this notion of civilizing the wild, whether that be the wild landscape or the Indigenous tribes who lived here. So it absolutely was, and it was considered first for decades before, but hockey overtook it, and it overtook it for a number of reasons. One, I think, is the romance of the winter is just too powerful. But there are also some specific details about the way the sports were organized. Lacrosse was far too amateur. Hockey was very quick to professionalism, spoke more to working class sensibility and roots, was more easily picked up, more popular. So there's a bunch of reasons why it happened. But happy to answer that question. Okay, anybody else have anything, any other question? If not, I'm going to wrap this up. We're all an hour later than we should be, I guess. It's like we all feel like it's about 10 o'clock. I was up real early. Excellent. I'm so happy that it arrived, Sheila, and thanks so much for attending. I hope it makes the reading easier. That's kind of the hope, is that it's an orientation into the reading, because it's not any last thoughts? Just thank you to everybody who purchased it. Again, it's truly remarkable and amazing to me. There's not a lot of hockey in this book. It's a lot of politics. It's a lot of evolution of ideas. It's a lot of sport in terms of how sport merges with politics. So if you're not getting a lot of hockey, it's because I didn't write about hockey. I wrote about politics and ideas around hockey. Okay. And I got chastised by my sport history committee for not writing a sport history dissertation in a sport history program. But that didn't stop them from saying it was one of the best, if not the best dissertation that they'd ever seen. And that's what allowed me to get it. They told me to go and get it. They told me to submit it as a manuscript for a book. That's why I got accepted. And eventually, even though none of the academics in my field liked the book, apparently it still got published. So that's great. And I didn't write it for the people in my field. I wrote it for people outside of it. So that would be it. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Perfect. Yes. Good. Yes. Not necessarily in the waging of war, but Britain, I mean, Britain gave the world sport, and they gave it sport through their empire, and they gave it through their officer class. And the officer class was trained at the English public schools, and the English public schools was the place where sport actually was refined and codified and resuscitated. So the British were the very first to give us the idea, and everybody in the world who plays sport, we all play it in the mold, in the shadow of the British, because it's their idea. We're just adapting it. And the idea that sport even can represent a nation is a British idea. They're the very first to do it with the sport of cricket. In the 18th century, they were calling cricket the national sport of England. England was the only place to play sports in the 18th century, and coming into the 19th century in terms of physical activity. All of the other European countries did calisthenics or gymnastics. They did not have team games. It was only the British that had team games. This led to the very famous Duke of Wellington saying, right, the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, meaning that playing rugby and cricket at the English public schools is what gave the British their tremendous fighting skill and organizational skill to become the world's greatest military empire, the greatest economic power, the engine of the Industrial Revolution, all that fun stuff. So the British were they are the ones that gave everything to the world. And that's one of the reasons why, I mean, it didn't necessarily come through in today's talk, but that's one of the reasons why I focus so hard on the evolution of liberal political thought, because it's really something that transforms from Great Britain and has a tremendous impact on the way the rest of the world understands sport and marshals sport as a kind of social technology in using it as a national identifier. Thanks everybody for the congratulations and the kind wishes. I hope that maybe answers the second part of your question there, Uncle Mark, about England. I'm not sure about the recruiting of soldiers to wage war. The English were not very good about how they got people to fight their wars. They were really nasty, impressing people. I mean, the British soldiers were like the criminals. They were like the scum, right? They're the scum of British society. But it was up to the officer class. It was up to the officer class that turned them into the best soldiers. And it was the officer class that spread the idea of sport. And so if you're a British soldier and you're stationed in Bangladesh or India, right, or somewhere on the Canadian prairie, it's up to the officer class to make sure that you don't just drink your day away and start terrorizing the locals, which they did quite a bit. So a sport like cricket, where you play for 3 days, is a great way to keep them fit, keep them orderly, keep them disciplined, keep them British, but also to keep them entertained, right? So sport and war and sport and soldiering in the British Empire is very tightly knit. I'm just not sure that sport was ever used to recruit soldiers, because they didn't really recruit soldiers as much as like force the worst people of society to become soldiers in the British sense. So hopefully that maybe answers that part of your question there. All right. Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm going to sign off. Thank you everybody for, again, attending. It warms my heart that I can give this talk and that people will come and listen. And I really am proud to be able to deliver to family and friends, the thing that I've been working on, that I told you that I've been working on for so long. And the questions, when's the book coming, or what are you researching? Well, now I can finally share it with everybody. And I'm glad that I could share it a little bit more intimately as well. Okay. So thanks everybody. Have a great night. Thanks for joining me. I'll send out some details on the the signed copies through the email list. So thanks everybody. Have a great night. And thanks again. I'm going to end this. I think that actually went well for the, I'm also really bad at technology. So I think I figured this out okay. So thanks everybody. Great. Thanks, James. I appreciate the kind words. Have a great night, everybody. And I'll probably try to do some more of these like public talks or lectures around some of the things I talk about in my classes. I'll try and make them interesting. Have a good one, everyone. Bye.